A very good morning to all SASI Creative Institute of Design lecturers and students. Good morning. Firstly, I would like to say thank you so much to Prof. Maninder Singh, who is the director of SASI Creative Institute of Design, for inviting me as a speaker for today's session on Talk of Design and Global Culture in the 21st Century. So this is actually a moment that I really look forward and waiting for, because this kind of a sharing session is actually something kind of an interesting to share about design and what are the things that we can do actually to promote a kind of a better living for the society, um, as our role as designer, especially in the 21st century. So actually all of you can scan me, okay, through the QR code. My name is Associate Professor Dr. Ellie Sabrina Ismail, and I'm actually from the Architecture Program, Faculty of Built Environment and Surveying, University Technology Malaysia. And the details of my CV, you can scan through my QR code and get the details of me myself and what are the contribution in terms of research and journals, papers, and publication that I had been published for the rest of 15 years as my career as an academician. So, and a part of being an academician, I'm also actively doing research with the Malacca Museum Corporation. And actually, I'm currently running a research center with the Malacca Corporation Museum, which is known as PERSIM. And the research center is actually known as the Conservation for Sustainable Ethnic Heritage, or CASI. So this research center is actually quite new because it was established by the Malacca Museum Corporation in July 2023. And the focus of this research center is actually looking into tracing the lost ethnicity, culture, and hybridity and adaptation through all ethnic groups throughout the world. And currently we are focusing on three major ethnic groups, which is found in Indonesia and also in India. And these are some of the actually case study and projects that we have done in this research center known as CASI. One of it was that we had actually engaged with the local community heritage, which is the Chetia people. And this was done actually a research that started in 2022 and it's still going on up until now, where we collaborate with the Vellore Institute of Technology in India and also tracing the lost ethnicity of Chetia people in India and also in Malaysia. And there are some written publication journals, and also we also did documentation in terms of the architectural buildings belong to the Chetia people, like the temples and houses. And we did a lot of documentation like measured drawings and things like that. So, and a part of that, not only we're looking on the tangible heritage, we also look into the intangible heritage, like the Chetia culture, the culinary, the customs, and also the belief system of the Chetia people. And we also did studies on that. And a part of that, we also look into another ethnic known as the Malabari ethnic, which is also commonly found in India and in Malaysia also. And there are some documentation that also we did on the Malabari communities, and we also did trace in terms of the tangible heritage, like the mosque architecture owned by the Malabari community. And we did a comparative analysis of this mosque design between Malaysia and also India. And we trace all of these architectural design mosque throughout the country, like in Malaysia itself, in Singapore, in India, and things like that. So, and apart from that also, this center also looking into the Bugis community, and this was actually a current research that currently running at the moment in 2023, where we look into the Bugis community. And last 2 weeks, we had a visit to Makassar in Indonesia, which is at the southern Sulawesi, and we visited some of the Bugis community down there, and we did trace a lot of the intangible and tangible cultural heritage. So basically, that is what my contribution and also my involvement in doing research as part of being academician, I'm also actively running the Kasih Research Center, which is known as Center of Conservation of Sustainable Ethnic and Heritage. So for those of you who are interested in knowing more about ethnic heritage, please do contact me, and maybe we can have a discussion on collaboration talking about ethnic heritage from the intangible and tangible perspective. So for today's talk, my focus will actually be on design for living, or is it living by design? So these are actually the two statements that sometimes really triggers our mind as designers, especially for the first year students. So are we going to be designers just to earn an income for a living, or become something like a profession? Or is it that we actually design for humanity, for people to live in? Not only talking about economy status, not only talking about dollars and cents, but designing for the sake of humanity and for the sake of the community. So this will actually be the focus of my talk for today's morning session. So if you look at these two pictures, traditional versus modernity. So both of these buildings, as you can see, is actually designed by human, designed by people. But if you look on my left hand side, the picture of the village house, it was not designed by designers. It was not designed by architect. It was not designed by professional. The ideation of the design comes from the genius loci, or what we call the local wisdom of the people, that is actually triggered from the customs, the tradition, and also from the belief system of the local communities. That what triggers the design of the building. But if you look on the left-hand side, the building, especially the modern design of houses, it is actually being designed by the designers, by modern designers, by professional people. But if you can see these two sets of maturity in design, there are two different kind of an appearance, or what we call impressions into it. Because why? If you look into the traditional building design, it looks more comfortable in that sense, because it actually respect the idea of genius loci and the local wisdom. And if you can see how the village houses design, it is much more perfect in that sense, where it actually answers the idea of thermal comfort, it answers the idea of comfortability of the needs of the people and things like that. But if you look into the modern living, there's a lot of issues and problem that actually arises in terms of social status, in terms of economy, in terms of perception of people and things like that. So this is where actually comes into place, and look back into the title of what I'm discussing today. Is it that we're going to become designers for a living, or we're going to live by design? So these are two sets of things that I think we need to look into this morning session. So if you look at this picture also, on my left hand side is actually a Nyano Mosque. And the Nyano Mosque is actually was first built in 1948, and it was not designed by an architect. It was designed basically by the Dejin community, who are actually the native bricklayers, and they use their own expertise using mud and mud wall, and using whatever the sustainable material that is available on site to come up with this kind of mosque design. But the beauty part of the mosque, because it was designed according to the regional context and to the local wisdom, it really fits to the need of the people, and it really fits to the function of the people and the community itself. And when the Yono Mosque was designed, it is actually fit with the local climate. And at the end of the day, it really gives comfort to the user in terms of the functionality, and in terms of the space layout, and in terms of the form making. But if you look at the left-hand side, it is a Sheikh Zayed Mosque, which is the rank as the ninth among the largest mosque in the world. And this mosque looks very, very monumental. Of course, if you look to compare between the Nayono Mosque and the Sheikh Zayed Mosque, the Sheikh Zayed Mosque is actually extremely monumental, and it's adorned with a lot of aesthetical values, and it looks very grandeur in that sense. But if you look in terms of the functionality, The Sheikh Zayed Mosque is actually more kind of a pleasing to the eye in terms of the aesthetics, but it doesn't give quite a good sense of functionality to it, especially in terms of thermal comfort and in terms of the user's needs itself, because the mosque was simply designed some sort of like a house of God, as a house of worship, and more like a symbol, a political symbol and economic symbol status of the country. So this is where it looks at two different things when you could become a designer. Sometimes when you design a building, like Amos Rapopo always say, when you design a building that is based on the local wisdom and based on the genius loci and based on the local needs, sometimes do you need an architect to design a building? Do you need a professional to design a building? Because the building will be beautified by itself when it comes out naturally from the setting, more like a kind of an organic kind of an architecture or approach. This is the most common thing if you see throughout the world nowadays. Okay, so the first one is a Sheen Crystal building. It was designed by Daniel Lipskin. You have the Dancing House in Prague, designed by Frank Gehry, and you have Zaha designing the Performing Arts Centers. And there's a lot of building designs talking about beautiful, beautiful buildings. But the most important thing here is that when we argue about the word of functionality to it, how does design actually comes to the idea of functionality to the user? Because sometimes architects, they are engrossed and actually they are more looking into the aesthetical values, which is the form making, that is more pleasing to the eye rather than looking into functionality. And this what goes sometimes against the idea of the modernists when they talk about form follows function, or when Mies van der Rohe talk about less is more. So when we look back into this kind of a statement, sometimes it gives you an argue mindset whether how you're going to become a good designer. Are you designing just because you're going to produce a sculptural kind of a building, or is it that you're going to design a building that is functional, that is actually meet to the purpose of the user requirement? So these are the two things that sometimes it actually need to goes hand in hand when we become as a designer. So we have to look both into the reality of living, talking about the needs and the function of people, the first that we need to put into, rather than we look into the aesthetical values. The aesthetics can come in later because it is actually the makeup that made the whole interior form making of the building. But the most important thing, which is the planning layout or the spacing layout, that talks about functionality into it. So in this sense, if we look into that matter, um, need to go back to the concept of local wisdom. And local wisdom talks about regional kind of an identity, meaning that looking into the local climates, the local belief, and the local custom. And this what makes the beauty part of being an architect and designers, to produce buildings that is actually to fulfill the needs of the society and the needs of the community. So if you want to know more about the value of regional architecture and why do we really need to look back into regional architecture as a designer, because it will look back into producing a building with a sense of identity, with a sense of local identity into it. And once a building have the sense of local identity, it can automatically unify the society. And for those of you out there, students and lecturers who wants to know more about the idea and what or the essence of regional architecture, you can always look into my podcast. And this one of the talk that I record with the BFM radio, which is a local radio station. And you can scan the QR code and get the details, and you can listen on my lecture and my talk talking about regional architecture, focusing in the context of Malaysia, and how do we as an architect or designers need to respond into the role of regional architecture to produce an architecture building or the built environment that actually fulfill the needs of the local society. So is design important? It's a big question. Yes, it is important. So look back into today's topic. Are we designed for a living, or do we live living by design? So these are the two things that is actually look contradicts. But we as a designer, we should choose and we should know our path in what way that we should look into it. So what is actually design? How do designers think and act? And why do we actually design? Okay, so the word design actually can be used as a noun and a verb. So if it's a verb, to design means you want to create or develop something. You want to produce something like a structure, a system, or a component. But if it becomes a noun, a design can be something resulting of something that you implement into it. So the word design here can be used both as a noun and also as a verb. But if you look at the word by Robert L. Peters, what he said was that design creates culture. Culture shapes values, and values determine the future. So in this sense, whether design is used both as a noun or as a verb, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, design creates culture. And when we talk about culture, culture is actually the way how we live in a society, the way how we act, the way how we behave, and the way how we tend to be. So culture is the most important thing, because without culture, humans don't have values of living. So, and design is actually influence that in developing values. And this value is really important actually in shaping the future generation and the future society. So I love to take this kind of a phrase by John Hackett when he mentioned in his book in 2005, where he talks about design is to design a design to produce a design. It looks complicated, it looks rhyming, but if we look into the noun word, design is a general concept. So it can be anything, whether you design a building, whether you design a fashion statement, whether you design a logo, whether you design a poster. Design is a very huge kind of an aspect. And is to design mean is an action. And design also can be a noun because it becomes into a plan or intention where it involves process of thinking. And at the end of the day, it becomes a noun again where it comes to the outcome, which is the result. So, and the result here is actually where the product can actually contribute back to the need of the society. So at the end of the day, design is like a process. It involves thinking. It involves a whole lot of unification into it. And it also involves a lot of involvement of people in decision making in producing a good design. So by right, if you can see, is that design is actually a profession, and it is very important because you need design to satisfy human needs, to improve people's life, and also to produce something that respecting to the welfare of the natural environment. And in this sense, if you look into more detail, design also involves innovative thinking, where it looks into a lot of imaginating things that which does not yet exist, but at the end of the day, it will can be appearing into a concrete form, which can become a purposeful addition, which actually contribute to the needs of the real world. So the very basal model of design for understanding is that it involves, like what I mentioned earlier, the process, the desired situation, a transformation from the current situation to make for a betterment for the future. And is design cognition a black box? And if you talk about a black box thinking like BBT, yes, because the question is that when you do design, you learn something and you make conclusion and you make justification, where you have the input ideation and then you have the output, which is the outcome product. And this is very important because it actually can change the world and can change the built environment. So if you look into the process of design, okay, it actually initiates change in man-made things. And it involves a lot of process into it, like social networking, experiencing, communication, opinions. It involves customs, festivities. It involves the way people behave and things like that, like tangible and intangible heritage elements and things like that. So at the end of the day, design actually can make a change. And the change is difference. And the change of difference is actually the process. And the change of process is actually an evolution. And the change of evolution is actually design. So design is very, very complicated in that matter because it involves differences, processes, evolution, and also involve innovative. And at the end of the day, it involves contribution back to the society. So if you look at these four pictures, this is actually some of the building photos taken in Malaysia. The first topmost is the Losong Museum. And the Losong Museum, when it was designed by the designer, it is actually tried to apply the ideation of a traditional Malay house. But the way how the designers or architects think when they design this Losong Museum was actually come in terms of a negative way of thinking, because they actually blow up the kind of a scale of a traditional anthropometric of a Malay house into a gigantic scale. So at the end of the day, the building anthropometrics in terms of the scale design looks gigantic and monumental without respecting the early tradition of the traditional Malay house anthropometrics. So in this sense, when I talk about the design process earlier, the design process embedded by the architect's thinking is actually on the reverse side of image of the building. So there's not a lot of thinking and justification taking into place because the architect just like preferring a building design into a metaphoric kind of expression of imitating rather than reviving back the ideation of the architecture. And this is actually different. If you look on the left-hand side, this is actually the National Museum designed by Tan Hock Keong, which is located in Kuala Lumpur and was built in the 1970s during the regional period in Malaysia. So it gives a different kind of a perspective where the National Museum, even though it looks gigantic in scale, but in terms of respecting the idea of revivalism kind of an architecture of the traditional Malay house in terms of the anthropometrics, is still balanced and it's still there. So, and this is where it looks that the designer put a lot of thinking into the design process. And if you look into the building down here below, this is a Parliament building designed by Ivor Shipley, which is a public work department's architect. The Parliament building here was designed according to the Genius Loci, which is the local climate of the Malaysian context, and it uses the concept of what we called ventilation holes to allow natural ventilation to come into the building. And it talks about a metaphoric kind of an expression that look into Malaysia as a democratic state in terms of the scale and in terms of the layout of the Parliament building. But on the left-hand side, which is the Perdana Putra, is an opposite because the designers adopt the neoclassical architecture style that actually resembles the King Louis XIV palace that was designed during the autocratic period. So this is where the losers of the ideation of democracy of Malaysia comes into place. But I won't go detail more explaining about the idea of building that become a political statement of the government and politicians and things like that. But if you want to know more, you can always Google my ResearchGate and also my Google Scholar, and you can look into the few papers that I talk about how bad designs are made by architects when they simply talk about imitating certain products without really understanding the meaning and the function and the aesthetical values behind the design of the building. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say here is that design thinking is very, very critical, because the way how we think in when we do the design, it is very important because it will produce the end product that can actually give a feeling, or it can actually give a sense of judgment to the user and also to the community, whether it is functional, whether it is just purely merely aesthetical, or whether it can be at the end of the day symbolizes certain identity into it. And the last picture that I'm trying to show you here is the Sunway Pyramid shopping complex, which is the most famous shopping complex in Malaysia. And this shopping complex actually resembles the Sphinx, which is the pyramid where actually the Pharaoh tomb was located. And if you talk about the Sphinx or the Pharaoh tomb, it is actually a sacred tomb where they buried the the kings, you know, the Egyptian kings and things like that. So it is more like a sacred ground for them. But this designer from Malaysia actually took this ideation of the Sphinx and also the Pharaoh tomb and turned it into an entertainment place, which is a shopping complex. So at the end of the day, it shows the idea of mockery to something that is sacred to become something like an entertainment at the end of the day. So this is where the wrong side of designers thinking comes into place. Like what I said before, when you just merely taking something out of the blue, imitate it just because for fun and just because it looks nice without having a clear justification and understanding about the role of thinking behind it. So if you look back into design, design is very unique. And as designers, you need to have a process of thinking. It needs to start from the existing situation about the issues and problem statement. And then you have to make a change into it through an imaginative and innovative manner. And from there, you need to make a plan and also need to produce something that actually for the preferred situation, for the benefit of the future society. And this is very critical because designers need to think critically and have a good justification into it. So, like Brian Lawson and Keith Dawes always says from his book taken from 2009, design is actually a mixture of creativity and analysis. It involves problem solving. It involves evolution. And at the end of the day, design will actually affects the fundamental of the human activity, and it can give creation to a lot of solution to a lot of problems at the end of the day if we look into the right side of become a designer and become a good designer. So at the end of the day, everyone is a designer, but you have to bear in mind, if you want to become a good designer, you need to have a good process of thinking and good judgment and be critical in how you approach certain situation and certain problems. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is that when we become a designer is that how can we contribute back to the betterment of the society. With that, I'd like to end my talk today. Thank you so much